We're going to be in 1 Corinthians 11 today, and there's going to be two primary topics that will be discussed and will be talked about. And the first one, when we were looking at matters of conscience and talked about that before, doesn't matter if you use red and white, black and white, there are some things that are right every time in every situation. There are some things that are wrong every time in every situation. But then there's a group of things in the middle that are matters of conscience. And today we're going to read, first of all, about Paul's instruction about the wearing of veils in public worship. And then he will go into what is one of the longest sections on the Lord's Supper that we have in the New Testament. No one knows this 100% sure, but a lot of people feel like the Gospels were written a little bit later. If that's true, the latter part of 1 Corinthians may be the earliest teaching that we have on the Lord's Supper outside the events that are given to us in the gospel accounts. So the central idea is that Paul is going to address concerns, and I use the word propriety, meaning what is appropriate, what is proper, and decency during public worship. And both of these will have background in terms of their first century culture, and particularly we're going to see Roman culture. But one of the terms that I thought would just be appropriate where we finished last week is that Paul makes a very specific case that spiritually he is their father in the gospel, meaning he was the one who first preached the gospel. He was the one who helped to found the church in Corinth. And when you come across this word imitate, like, for example, chapter 11, verse 1, imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is the word we get our English word mimic from. And people, especially who are really good at doing other people's voices, one of our preacher's wives in Sydney, if Pam can listen to you talk about 5 or 10 minutes, she can just, doesn't matter what the accent is, she just has this amazing ability to mimic very, very precisely how other people talk. So when you look back in chapter 4 and verse 16, here was our second request, petition in the book. And Paul says, I urge you to be imitators of me. And then where we finished last week in chapter 11, verse 1, and again you have one of these parentheses type things, Paul says, I want you to imitate me, and then here comes this qualification, this distinction, as I imitate or as I follow Christ. What is significant is that Paul will use this expression in other letters that he writes, but the only time that he will tell a church to imitate me will be a church that he started. Like, for example, he'll write to the Colossians, and I have heard about. And the churches that he writes to that he didn't start, he doesn't use this term imitate or mimic. And so this is going to be kind of an important part of this middle part of the letter. Paul is saying, yes, I started the church, and though I'm away, the letter is going to function as if I was there. And since I am your spiritual father in the gospel, then I want you to imitate me in the same way that I imitate Christ. So I want to read the section on head coverings. And in some congregations, I would assume ours, this is not a major topic. I have been in congregations where this is. And I would also say if you were a church in the Middle East today, this would have a whole different application than it does to us. But let's read 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 2. Now I commend you, and we're going to see a contrast later in the chapter. I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I handed them down to you. Just recently, I was visiting with some friends, and again, this is an overstatement, but this passage reminds me of this. And their comment was, well, let me take a step back and say it this way. I'm convinced that we follow the pattern that we have in the New Testament in terms of church order and church things. But I've heard people say, well, are we supposed to be like the church in Thessalonica? Are we supposed to be like the church in Rome? Or are we supposed to be like the church in Corinth? And they're kind of saying, and no, we shouldn't. But Paul has made this point. He teaches the same thing in every church. And while he will address different issues and different problems that arise, the Holy Spirit has seen fit to preserve for us these discussions of very specific issues for each church as guidelines for us to use for the rest of our lives. And I am very, very comfortable with the word pattern. Do you remember God told Moses, I want you to make everything according to the pattern that I gave you on the mountain. And the earthly things of the tabernacle are a shadow of the reality of things that are in heaven. And I feel the same way about this, in that as we have our New Testament unfold, then we're given instructions, and Paul isn't going to have a different church in Rome and then a different church in Corinth. And these traditions, the teachings that he delivers, is something that is passed down. We're going to come back to verse 3 and spend a little bit of time on this in a second, but listen very carefully how he opens. I want you to understand, and there's going to be three things that he's going to talk about. One, the head of every man is Christ. Second, the head of the wife is her husband. And third, the head of Christ is God. And at the bottom of the page, we're going to come back and just look at these very specifically. And so we'll keep reading, but just notice that this to me is a very important part of this section. And this also, I think, is illustrative of our New Testament. While Paul is dealing with a specific issue, which is going to be the wearing of veils, oftentimes he teaches us very significant things about both the name, the nature, and the purpose of God. And as he goes through this discussion, then we're going to come back and look specifically at Christ and where he fits into this. Verse 4 is going to be, to me, one of the important verses in this section. And again, we don't have this culturally in our context, but in a Roman culture they did. And let me just go ahead and say it this way. There are a number of everything from coins to engravings where Roman men typically covered their heads during worship. And what to me is so interesting about this passage is that most of the time when we talk about it, we talk about women and the veils, but as you're going to notice, the word man and the word woman is going to be used equally. And one of Paul's major teachings for people in the first century is that men, in spite of the fact that the custom of particularly Roman people who are worshiping was to have their heads covered in honor of their gods, then the men are not to have their heads covered. And we'll keep reading and notice what he says. Verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, because it is the same as if her head were shaved. If a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And let me just pause. Most of the time when Paul talks about matters having to do everything from marriage to families and other things, he very seldom talks about it from a first century point of view. And typically, Paul will go all the way back to the original creation. And very literally, when you read in Genesis that God put Adam to sleep, took a rib from his side, and from Adam he created woman, then Paul is going to reflect on those very, very early passages. Verse 10, this is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. And again, notice this collective. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth on specific things, but very clearly he says this is not just for you. These are both the traditions and the teachings of the churches of God. And this verse we looked at earlier, 4:16, I send to you Timothy, my beloved child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ as I teach them everywhere in every church. And so these instructions are going to be given specifically to Corinth, but they would apply to churches that are in other places as well. So we mentioned this, but this to me is one of the important things to bring about today. Richard Oster teaches New Testament, and Harding in Memphis has been moved back to Searcy, but he's taught there since 1978. And one of his specialties is just New Testament archaeology, things that were taking place in the first century and on and on. And because classes are offered online, for a very small fee, you can audit. And so recently I audited his New Testament world, and he had most of a whole section where he was showing pictures of men, Roman men in Roman culture, who had their heads covered during worship. And what to me is instructive about that is that typically, as I have heard this passage growing up and listening to other people talk about it, we have primarily talked about the women and their situation in the first century. But it's very interesting that probably the most corrective thing that he says to the church in Corinth was that men are not to have their heads covered in worship, as is the tradition in Roman culture. So I just listed some things in 1:1. There are pictures of these on coins, statues, descriptions in literature. There's some altar reliefs where there have been engravings made underneath an altar. And over and again, you will see that the Romans, and if you remember, Corinth is destroyed in 146, and then virtually 100 years later, Julius Caesar reestablishes Corinth in 44 BC as a Roman colony. So there's going to be a number of the members of the church in Corinth who are Roman citizens, and from their background, men would be very comfortable coming to church, and you have to think toga, okay? And a lot of these togas, and you'll see these especially, you'll see it occasionally with the Caesars, you'll see this, then the toga had this covering that a man could wear over his head, and as a sign of respect, and I'm using little g, O-D-S, in respect to the Roman gods, then Roman men were taught it was appropriate for them to wear this covering when they came to worship the Roman gods. And what's important about that, again, we read the passage, and the conversation is primarily about women, but as you notice, there's an equal opportunity to talk on both sides of this. 1, 2, in their culture, women not wearing a veil communicated the message of a woman who was either sensual or loose in her moral orientation. Every culture has certain values, certain mores. When we were students at Oklahoma Christian, we went with Ron Beaver twice to Belize, British Honduras, because Ron Beaver found out this was the only English-speaking country in the world that didn't have a Lord's Church meeting. There had been a few Christians, and so 20 of us went down and spent 3 weeks teaching and working with people. I can't remember if it was the first or second time, but when you're in the tropics and you're just trying to get accustomed to things, we sit down on the steps of the post office, okay? We're just in between Bible studies, and we sit down on the steps of the post office, and we hadn't been there very long, and an elderly man came up, and he tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Son," he said, "in Belize, the only people who sit on the steps of the post office are soliciting sex," which we both then just stood up immediately because we were just tired, and we were going to just have a break. Sorry, this is kind of crude, but probably about 10 times a day I was asked, "Is the doll for sale?" And so in their culture, if you were soliciting sexual activity, then you sat in public places like on the steps of the courthouse. That would never have crossed our mind. We had no idea. I did thank the man profusely because if you're on a campaign for Christ, the last thing you want to be communicating is something that is just totally opposite of what you're there to do. And this is what's going on in Corinth, in that both the wearing of veils as the sign of authority for men was very appropriate when you're worshiping in a Roman religious context. And in the same way, you can hear some of the women saying, "All things are lawful for me," and while the women may have had the veil, so you have two things happening. Paul is saying to the men, "Don't," and then he's saying to the women, "I want you to wear the veil because of the cultures that are there." These little drawings down at the very bottom to me are just really, really important because these have application in a whole group of things. And I put them in a little bit different order, but this is how I like to think about this. Notice the first thing. He says, God is the head of Christ. So just think about that. God is the head of Christ. I'm sure there's a part of this we'll only understand on the other side, but that even though he were God, he emptied himself and he took on the form of a servant, and being found in the form of a servant, he's going to die. Christ emptied himself of some divine prerogative when he becomes flesh. And how often does Jesus, and using a biological figurative term, refer to my Father? And in fact, the Jews are very critical of that because how dare you speak to my Father? But think this through. God is the head of Christ. And then when you come to the middle, then he says Christ is the head of man. And he's very specific on that. And then he's going to say, man is the head of woman. I've mentioned this to you. And again, here's a matter of conscience. I have a couple of really good friends that just basically decline doing weddings for non-Christians. They just said they're, and they have their personal reasons. My thinking is, if I can do a wedding with a non-Christian couple, what a great opportunity to talk to them about the gospel and the Lord and beginning a new life and stuff. And I wasn't going to change her mind, but we got to the point about doing the vows, and she stomped her foot and she hit the table and she said, "We are not going to have any of those old-fashioned words like submit or obey in our vows." I shouldn't have said this, but I said, well, I wouldn't want to tell an untruth about something that you have no intention of doing, should I? And she just said, "Please tell me you didn't say that." And I said, well, it just slipped out. But she just, she was just adamant. But here's what I want you to think about. Is Christ inferior because God is his head? I mean, seriously, think about that. Is Christ inferior in any way at all because God is his head? Men, are you inferior because Christ is your head? And what some people in culture today get to thinking, we have to have this equality type thing and all do and be the same thing. But Paul's very specific that in spiritual matters, there is a matter of, and headship is not abusive. And you think, did God ever do anything to diminish or in any way harm his son? And headship, rather than just being I'm the boss and I'm telling people what to do, headship is also a sense of responsibility for nurturing and caring and looking after. And so in this context, then Paul says, and it's very specific, God is the head of Christ, and in this sense, Christ chooses to allow God to do that. There are all kinds of people in our community today who are men that Christ is not their head. A man has to choose to allow Christ to have the headship over him, and then he's going to use the same example then in our families in terms of man being the head of the woman. And it's not because he's superior. In fact, I look at it the other way. Man has the same responsibility to look after the well-being of his wife, the same way that Christ looks after the well-being of the man. And so rather than headship being just this I'm the boss type thing, headship is more the sense of having the responsibility to care, and the terms that are used in Ephesians 5 about the church, Christ is going to nurture and feed the church in that context. So when you read the section on the veils, notice this, both genders are a part of this discussion, and men are mentioned 14 times, women are mentioned 16 times, and with his head covered, then most of the people in this context, again, would think of men with a toga over their head. So here's our second page. In Christian worship in Corinth, men should be uncovered. And you read from Plutarch, one of the first century writers, for men, the wearing of the devotional head covering was a sign of giving honor to, and again, I spell little G-O-D-S. And so if you were trying to display a sense of piety and righteousness in the Roman religions, then it was very appropriate then for men to cover their heads in honor of their gods. Paul says, in the church, men should keep their heads uncovered because they are the glory of God's creation. And women, in the created order, is the glory of man, and therefore she must pray and prophesy in the presence of men with her head covered. And so here's 3:2. In their day, for a woman to participate in worship with her head uncovered was to engage in an act of dishonor. And Paul is talking about, just go ahead and shave your head if you're just going to be that independent, and I would say probably in this culture out of place. And Paul is going to talk about this in terms of the order of creation, not just of culture, even though it's a very cultural matter. So 4 things that Paul talks about: the order of creation, what is proper, what is seemly at the time, the teaching of nature, and the general practice of the church. And so when we look at this example from the previous page, Christ is very comfortable with God being his head. Christ is also on the other side of the equation with being the head of man, and there is no sense that he is morally, spiritually, personally inferior in any way because God is his head. So here's number 6, and let me just say this. My great-grandmother, who, and I've told you, she could quote the majority of the New Testament from memory, much of the Old Testament, she always had a scarf on. It was her conviction that she should have her head covered. And I've worshiped with brethren from South Africa, and a lot of this is taught in South Africa, and I've been in churches where maybe a third plus of the women had some type of covering on their head. And I'm not trying to be inappropriate, I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I'm not sure that a hat with a lovely lace veil is exactly what Paul had in mind in the first century. But my grandmother wore a scarf, and this is my thinking on this, and here's the conscience matter. I would never discourage someone who felt like, in their conscience, a woman should have her hair covered, and in any form ridicule her or tell her she shouldn't. When we talk to having 2 daughters, you have to do this whole, you don't have to, but the whole modesty thing comes up. And one of the things that we just said is that immodesty is not primarily only just what's too short and too tight, it's calling attention to yourself. And it's kind of hard for me to imagine today for a woman coming to worship and their veils would have been over like mainly only the eyes. And in our culture today, for a woman to come to church kind of looking like the Ku Klux Klan except with a slit in the middle would be calling undue attention to herself. However, we had friends that lived in Saudi Arabia, and the ladies always have to have the covering, but Bonnie said, you can cover her mouth, you can cover her nose, but he says you cannot cover her eyes. And she said, it is amazing what women can communicate in Saudi Arabia with their eyes, because that's their culture. And in a Middle Eastern situation, if that's what is proper, then for you to come to church like you are today would not be appropriate. I used an example. I don't see where I put it, but I'll just go ahead and mention this. We had a dear friend that went to a church in our larger area. She normally wore these just and very plain, but just wonderful dark blue dresses, sometimes blue polka dot. She had her grandmother's pearls and stuff. And we were talking to her, and she said, I was so embarrassed because she said, I was completely overdressed compared to all the other women who were at church that day. And she said, the next time we go back, and listen to her term, she said, I'm going to dress down because I don't want to go to church to primarily call attention to myself because I'm going to church to worship. And so in this area of conscience, like I said, I never discourage if a woman feels that way. The other side says in our culture, this doesn't have the same meaning and the same value that it did for people in the first century. So if you look at the very, very bottom, headship, and again, start with God being the head of Christ, the importance of our actions in worship, what is appropriate in different circumstances, and conscience, to me, are all important matters in this discussion. If you turn to the second page, we're going to read this extended section on the Lord's Supper. And this is one of the more familiar sections in Corinth because we oftentimes read this. But he is commending them at the start of this chapter. And then when he comes to 11:17, here's just the opposite. In the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. And let me just say this real quickly. I listened to one of our missionaries in New Zealand. This was decades ago. And this was, again, a brand new church. People had just become Christians. And he was invited over to a fellowship, a party, and they were primarily people who had just been baptized recently. And because they had just come out of the world, all of these people had drank profusely. And he said the majority of the people at the new Christian fellowship were drunk. They just weren't drinking, they were absolutely drunk because that had just been their lifestyle. He said, I just couldn't stay very long because I just became physically ill. But think again, coming completely out of darkness into the light is going to take time. And so the same thing is going to happen with these people taking the Lord's Supper. And Paul's saying, there are times when you guys get together to worship, it's worse off than virtually if you didn't. And notice what's going to take place. Verse 18, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And he started chapter 1 with that. I believe that there must be factions among you so that those who are genuine will be recognized. And we'll touch on that later. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one of you goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have houses to eat and drink in? Do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Can I commend you? No, I will not. So apparently, they were having a meal, and rather than having a fellowship meal where everyone shares, then some people both were eating to the point and drinking to the point that they were getting drunk before the Lord's Supper took place. There are other people over here who either didn't have anything or bring anything, and they're totally without. So you have kind of both extremes taking place. That which I received from the Lord, I delivered to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, and we're going to come back to that word, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it. And he said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup after supper. This cup is the new covenant, which is such an important word, in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of concerning the body and the blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself, and so eat of the bread and drink the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged, for we are judged by the Lord, and we are disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment, and other things I will give directions when I come. When I'm in Australia, I occasionally worship with a church that only has a meeting hall. They don't have individual classes. And the leaders decided the one thing that we think is the most important thing is the Lord's Supper. And every Sunday, this church spends an hour just on the Lord's Supper. And you stop and think, how many songs do we have about the cross and about the resurrection and the other things? And their thinking is, if we can't meet in individual groups in smaller classes, the one thing that we want to focus on is the importance of the Lord's Supper. And when I think the Lord's Supper, there are at least four, and you can probably think of others, but you can spend a lot of time thinking about the past in terms of do this in remembrance of me. Secondly is going to be examine yourself. There's a whole part of the Lord's Supper that is intended for personal reflection, and I think that both in terms of life and living and how we're conducting ourselves. I think of the term without, discerning the body. Some wonder if this is the body of Christ. I tend to think that the body is this, the church, because what are they doing? Some people are eating and getting drunk. They're disregarding the other people, and so there's a part of the Lord's Supper. If I discern the body, then I am thinking and considering about my brothers and sisters in Christ who are part of this. That's also an appropriate part of the Lord's Supper, and then the future, until I come. Every culture is going to do this a little bit differently. I have friends who worship in Southeast Asia, and I think Sao Paulo is now close to 20 million or something. If you're in a church of 20 million people, you're not going to come back at 5 o'clock. It is such a chore and such a job to get 2 services at one time. And so there are a lot of churches that when they get together, they stay together for an extended period of time. I have friends in Southeast Asia, and they said Sunday morning church typically goes 4 to 5 hours. And they will have teaching activity or singing, and they'll stop and do this or that. And because it takes so long to get together, then that's something that is both expedient, and it would just virtually be impossible to make that long of a trip twice a day. But in cultures who do this, they spend an extended period of time during the Lord's Supper. And I include this on the second page, but let me just mention this. John Maples, dear friend in South Africa, was barefoot all the time. He said other than being forced to wear shoes at church, he just never wore shoes. He said his mom would lay him on a table with a heat lamp and take a needle, and she would examine his feet because he couldn't feel, stickers and stuff in his feet, and they would get infected. And so John says, when I think of examine yourself, he said, I know he's talking spiritually, but he said, I see myself on my tummy in South Africa and my mom taking a needle and examining my feet to see if there's things that need to come out so I don't get infected. And you stop and think, how much more spiritual would our lives be if we took more time to spiritually examine ourselves in that context? So some highlights on the back page, and I'll leave you to look at several of these words. The word genuine is something that's real. If there's divisions, it will show those who are genuine. And I gave examples of the word unworthy. One of the translations was careless. Do not take the Lord's Supper thinking about other things in a careless manner. Examine is the word to prove by testing. Judge, evaluate yourself. And I think it's appropriate, and I just tend to think of the last week, but it could be longer. But isn't it appropriate during the Lord's Supper to think of things that have happened both good and both bad? And sometimes during the Lord's Supper, I thought, Lord, if you give me another chance to do this, by the grace of God, I will try to do this differently next time. And those are all appropriate things for us to do during the Lord's Supper. And the word judging, we're to spend time, not spending more of our time judging others, but also to judge ourselves. I want to read this last paragraph because I just think this is appropriate. We could do an entire lesson on revelation because Paul says, I'm giving you what I received from the Lord, and we're going to have direct revelation that takes place. But here's our final thought. The word betray can also be translated to hand over. And I'm thinking of Judas and Jesus being handed over. The Passover feast, which was the context, remembered the passing over of the death angel in Egypt. And during the Passover, Jesus was physically handed over to be crucified. After his resurrection, Jesus then delivered these instructions to Paul so that during the Lord's Supper we might do this in remembrance of me. The bread and the cup are to be a permanent reminder that instead of death passing over Jesus, he was handed over to die. And that to me is a really profound thing for us to think about. The Passover, the passing over the death angel, and during the Passover, rather than Jesus being passed over, he was handed over to die. Therefore, Jesus delivered these teachings to Paul. So, as long as each of us live, every week we have the privilege of proclaiming, by our faithfulness in doing this, proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes again.